So at the Crossings right now, we're in a series of sermons called God's at War. And actually, it's a lot more than just a series of sermons. It's something that we're doing as an entire church. And throughout the week, we have groups that meet all over the place. We have groups that meet all the way from over in Alton, Illinois, all the way out here, and all the way along the way in different towns. And basically what we do is we sit down and we watch a video that talks about the idols and the things that wage war in our hearts to replace God. And we watch these videos and we get a chance to sit down and look each other eyeball to eyeball, and we get a chance to open God's Word and say, what is it in our lives that is trying to replace God and deal with the idols in our lives that want to dethrone God? And those small groups, if you haven't joined one yet or you haven't been going, let me encourage you to jump in as soon as possible. If you're new around here, just talk to whoever brought you or talk to anybody here and be like, hey, I want to go to one of these groups. And I promise you that you will find a loving, welcoming environment where you can go, you can get to know people, have a great time, but also be challenged to have a better life, the kind of life that God had designed for you by dealing with those things in your life that kind of want to edge God out. This week, we're going to be talking about the God of pleasure. And a lot of times in our lives, I believe that we find ourselves seeking things that will make us happy, things that will please us, and we're chasing after those things, but rather than finding the thing that we thought we were going to get, we seek pleasure, but we find pain. And we end up looking around and saying, man, I thought this was going to feel so good. I thought this was going to be so great. Why am I so miserable? And so today we're going to be talking about that. Recently, a movie came out called Pain and Gain. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this movie, but this movie, it's a movie about some bodybuilders. And in the movie, these bodybuilders are kind of your stereotypical meatheads. Not that every meathead is a stereotypical meathead. Not every big guy is this big dumb oaf, but these guys are your stereotypical meatheads. I was going to tease Mitch and have Mitch stand up for us and give you an example, but Mitch is too bright for that, so we won't embarrass Mitch. But these guys in this movie, they're these humongous bodybuilders, and it's got Mark Wahlberg in it and The Rock, and they're just massive. I mean, just huge in this movie. But they're trying to find something that's going to please them. They're not satisfied with where life is, so they're seeking after pleasure. And so they come up with these really stupid ideas of kidnapping people and getting them to sign over all their stuff to them. And then, you know, the plan basically falls apart. And it's hilarious to watch because you got these big, stupid guys who think they have this great plan for how they're going to find pleasure. And it falls apart and ends up coming back and smacking them in the face. And you see failed and botched kidnap attempts. And it's just ridiculous. But throughout the movie, like, they seem so stupid in their plans that throughout the movie it keeps flashing up on the screen, this is still a true story. And they're trying to remind you that people really are this stupid. Sometimes people get something in their head and they're so dumb that they will do idiotic and crazy things to find pleasure. And as I was watching it, I kept catching myself going, nobody is this stupid. There is no one who would do the things that these guys are doing and do them so foolishly. How could they be so moronic? And then as I was watching and thinking about that, I was like, man, you know what? We all do that. And then I started thinking about today's sermon and who we were going to be talking about in today's sermon. And I'm like, Samson was your stereotypical meathead when you read this story. Samson, I don't know what you know about Samson, but Samson is probably in the Bible one of the guys who is the most driven of all the Bible characters by pleasure. You see Samson make mistake after mistake after mistake, and every mistake you see him make it in the Bible, you can connect it to him seeking out pleasure and trying to find something that was going to fulfill him and make him happy. And so today as we walk down through this lesson, you're going to see that same thing. You're going to see a man who had the opportunity for such an incredible life. This man who is known for being the strongest man, a man who little kids grow up and they're like, that's the dude I want to be like. I want to kill wild animals with my bare hands, and I want to catch a bunch of foxes and tie their tails together, set them on fire and let them run through the fields of my enemies. Like, this is this dude that like growing up, I was like, that is the man right there. That's who I want to be like. He had such great potential. But what you see in his life is that who should have been God, the one true God, Jehovah, who he should have been worshiping, is dethroned and is replaced by pleasure. And when pleasure becomes my God, just like Samson, I myself will find myself falling into the same traps as Samson. And one of those first things that we need to understand, when pleasure becomes our God, just like Samson, we'll find ourselves doing things like reneging on the commitments in our life that are really important. You know, we have in our lives there are things that we have been committed to that are so desperately important. You know, if you're a parent today, if you're a father or a mother and you look and you have children, you have a commitment to those children. You have a commitment to your loved ones. You have commitments at your jobs. You have commitments all over the place that matter. But when pleasure becomes our God, what tends to happen is God is pushed off the throne, pleasure takes over, and we start forgetting about the things that actually matter in life. See, in Samson's life, this is something that you see happen. And in Judges chapter 13, verse 5, an angel comes. God sends an angel to Samson's parents. And he comes to them, and he's going to tell Samson's parents about some commitments that they need to make and about the commitments that Samson is going to make as a Nazirite. You see, he was a Nazirite man, and that meant there were certain vows and certain commitments that he was going to make, that he was going to keep. And so God sends this angel, and he says, let me tell you about your son, what he's going to be like. And in Judges 13:5, this is what he says. You'll become pregnant and have a son whose head is to never be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines. You see, this man is supposed to be a man who makes this commitment to God because God wants to use Samson to do something phenomenal. This commitment is something that really matters because the Israelites are God's people. They're basically Samson's family. And God is coming and he's saying, listen, Samson is going to be a man who is going to commit his whole life to me. And because of that commitment, I'm committing to using him to saving all of my people, to saving all the people in his family, all of the people that he loves. And God is placing this burden upon Samson and this commitment. And he's saying, this is what he is going to be the most important thing in his life, is delivering God's people. And you and I have things like that in our lives to where we have commitments, people that rely on us, people that need us in their lives. But whenever pleasure becomes our God, just like you're going to see with Samson, those important commitments are often forgotten and pushed to the side as well. Yesterday, I was driving down Highway 70, and there was a car on 70, and it was driving extremely erratically. It was like slowing down real slow, like to 40 miles an hour on the highway, and then they would take off again, and they were swerving, and I'm like, man, this is crazy. And I knew something had to be wrong, and I could see a car seat in the back, and I was like, man, something crazy is going on in that car. So I pull up like 2 lanes over because I'm not getting in the lane next to it. But I pull up and I look over, and there's a man and a woman in the front seats, and the man is just out of it, like passed out. Like he just looks like he is just gone. Like he's like doing this the whole time, and every time the car turns, his head is bobbing around. And I look at the lady who's driving and the mother, and I look at her as she's driving down the highway, and she is also just like zoning out, and like she just looks like there's no expression, nothing, just gone. They were high as a kite. And I looked at that and I thought, man, that's awful. But the really horrible thing about the situation is the dad has 2 infants in his lap on Highway 70. And I look at that as a father and I'm like, who in the heck would think that that is an okay thing to do? Who would put their children, these people who are depending upon them, in that kind of danger? Who would ever think that doing that is something is okay? You know what? Those parents forgot that they had a commitment, and they had been seeking pleasure, and that pleasure had made them totally forget and abandon a commitment they had made when they became parents to take care of those kids. And I'm on the phone with 911, and I'm like, somebody needs to pull these people over now, and those kids need to be taken out of that car immediately. And it was a horrible thing. And you know, it's easy for us to look at situations like that and be like, yeah, definitely the God of pleasure has control in their life. And that's like this crazy thing that you see happen that you're like, I can't believe that. And sometimes it's easy for us to be like, well, I would never get high like that and drive my kids around in the car. But you know what? There are lots of other situations in our lives to where pleasure takes over and we forget the commitments and the important things in our lives. And there are things that we don't think about very often, like maybe you went to the doctor, and you know people like this who have went to the doctor, and the doctor says, listen, if you continue eating the way that you eat, it is going to kill you. You have got to change your diet because you are going to have a heart attack, or your diabetes is going to kill you, or whatever it is. You've got to change the way you're eating because you are not going to be around to see your kids graduate from high school. You're not going to be around to take care of your family. And we see people like that all the time, and they leave there, and they have this important commitment, but yet they still go, and you still see them eating things they should have no business eating. Because we look and we see food, and it's something that sometimes it can pleasure us, and we look at it like, but it just looks so good. And we completely forget what the doctor just told us. We completely forget that the doctor just said, listen, if you want to be around for your children, for this great commitment in your life, you've got to change the way that you're behaving. You've got to change what you're indulging in. But you see, whenever pleasure becomes our God, when it becomes the thing that sits on the throne, all of those important things in our life, we forget and we abandon and we renege on those commitments, and it's a disaster waiting to happen. Samson has all of these commitments. His commitment that he made to God is so important because so many people are depending on him. So many people are going to be holding on to the fact that he is going to be the one that is to deliver God's people. His family's freedom, they have been enslaved, and his family's freedom depends upon it. And what we see Samson begin to do is completely forget all about that, because he looks and says, oh man, I want that because that's going to please me. That's going to make me happy. And God comes and he tells Samson's parents, listen, these are the commitments Samson's going to have to make. And we're going to go through those in a minute in detail. But he says, but this is why he's committing to these things. This commitment matters. And you and I need to realize we have people in our lives, whether you have children or not, you have loved ones in your life, you have people you work with, you have people who you interact with every day, who God has designed for you to be able to be a positive factor in their life that can help save them from things that can destroy their lives. But whenever we allow pleasure to take over in our lives, we abandon that commitment and their ability to be saved. When pleasure becomes my God, just like Samson, I will renege on the commitments that are so important. Second of all, I will resist the advice of the godly people around me. You see, whenever we find something that pleases us, we tend to tune out everything else. We tend to tune out the people who are there that God has placed in our lives to step in, to help us overcome and help us to get past those things. When they start talking, it's like we hit the mute button whenever pleasure's the king, whenever pleasure's the God of our lives. And you see Samson doing this very thing. In Judges 14, verses 1 through 4, it says, Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman. He told his father and mother, I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore, get her for me as a wife. Then his father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all of your people that you would go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me. She looks good to me. You see, Samson has godly people around him, his parents who have committed to helping him with his vows, his parents who love God and have a deep faith in him. And Samson is about to make a mistake, and his parents say to him, wait a minute. Listen, can't you find a godly woman, a woman who serves the same God as us? God has told us not to go do this, and you're going to go get involved with this Philistine woman, this woman. These are the people who have us enslaved, and God has told us not to do this. And they're trying to talk Samson out of it, but Samson's brain has completely disengaged. And I think we've all done this and also seen this happen before, especially us guys. You'll see something, and you're just like, vroom, and all of a sudden you see this girl, and you're just like, there's this tunnel vision that can take over. And everything that's going on around you, it just doesn't matter. And it's just craziness. You see it in movies, the guy's playing football and he goes to catch a pass and he catches the girl on the sideline, right? And the ball goes through his hands and he's standing there. Next thing you know, he gets hammered and somebody tackles and just creams him and he's still laying on the ground. He's still looking at the girl on the sidelines. And we laugh at that, but you know why we laugh at that? Because true things are the funniest things, right? Isn't that why we laugh at things like that? We get so focused in on these things that look good to us that we completely disengage our brains. And we have people around us who are designed to step into our lives and say, wait a minute, wake up. You need to think about this. And that's what Samson's parents do. They step in and they say, hey, that's a bad decision that you're about to make. Don't do this. And Samson says, she looks good to me. Think about what he says. She looks good to me. His parents give him reasons that he shouldn't be with her, but his whole focus is, that woman is fine, go get her. And to us, we look at that and we're like, I can't believe the way he's acting. I can't believe that he would do that. Yet we do the exact same things. We don't listen to the advice of the godly people around us. You've seen that with dating relationships with your friends. How many of you haven't had a friend to where they got involved with a relationship and everyone around is like, that guy is a dirtbag and she has no business being in a relationship with him because he is going to mistreat her, he's going to use her, and he's going to cast her to the side. And you try to say it, but the girl's like, oh, but he just makes me so happy. You know, and everybody around is looking and they're saying, no, this is a terrible idea. But he pleases me. He's so pleasurable. That's what I want. And everybody's going, no, don't do that. And it gets shut out. Or again with food, you know, maybe you're the one that went to that doctor and you're sitting at a buffet and you've got friends with you and you're at the Chinese buffet and those little sugar donuts are there. And trust me, I know all about those sugar donuts. You know, but you look at them and you're just like shoving them in, and maybe one of your friends is like, hey, didn't the doctor tell you, you know, you need to take it easy on the sugar and on the fried stuff? Man, that's not good for you. You're gonna keel over, man. And we tune them out. Oh, I've got this under control. It's not a big deal. I didn't have these earlier. So, you know, or I've been eating good today. And you just keep cramming them in your mouth because in the moment, that's what pleases us, right? You look at that and you're like, and we just completely disregard people in our lives who God has put there to help wake us up to dangerous situations. See, Samson sees this woman. He's like, oh, man, yeah. It's like he almost sounds like a caveman. Get me. You know, it's like he doesn't listen to anything that's going on around him. And in our lives, just like Samson, when pleasure becomes our God, we tune out everyone around us that God has placed there in order to help us avoid disaster. We've got to understand that when pleasure becomes our God, we resist godly advice. The third thing that we do is we refuse to listen to God. When pleasure is my God, I completely refuse to listen to God. You see, there were certain things that God specifically commanded Samson not to do. One thing he commanded him not to do that you see him disobey, which is in Judges chapter 14, he says, you're not to touch any unclean thing. See, Samson and his parents, actually, they weren't supposed to touch dead bodies. They weren't supposed to touch, a carcass of any kind, whether it be a human carcass or whether it be an animal. But Samson, as he's walking along, he meets this woman. He's going to meet that lady he met that he was completely already disregarding what his parents said. He goes to meet her. On the way, he's attacked by a lion, which maybe that should have been a clue. This is a bad idea. But he kills this lion. And then later, as he's passing back by the lion, he looks at this carcass, this dead animal that he killed. And inside of it, there's honey. And he looks down at that honey, and I love honey. I love honey. And, he looks at it and he's like, oh, that looks so good. And he reaches down and he breaks his covenant with God over honey, over food. And he reaches into that animal carcass and he pulls it out and he eats it. And the crazy thing is, not only does he do that, but then he takes it to his family. And he doesn't tell his family what he's done. He doesn't tell them where it came from. He allows them to also eat of this honey from this carcass. I think had they known, he knew they were going to try to hold him accountable, but he didn't care because pleasure was Samson's God. Again, he was going to disregard what they said anyway. He eats this honey and completely forgets what God told him. See, whenever we get involved in making pleasure our God, whatever God says doesn't matter because what we fixate on takes control. And we ignore the vow. He forgets the fact that he has made a vow to God that is going to allow him to save the people, so much so that he's going to allow a handful of honey to put that in danger. And you and I do the same thing. We let things creep in and control us, and we completely refuse to listen to what God has to say because we look and we're like, oh, that just looks so good. I've got to have it. Another thing that God told him not to do was to drink wine. And actually, he tells him not to basically drink anything that comes from a grape. He can't have olive oil, anything that resembles any kind of alcohol, anything that's fermented, anything that comes from a grapevine. He and his family, they're not supposed to be drinking it. And, as I was looking at this, I first started reading through it, and I'm like, oh, man, I don't see where Samson broke that. But then I started reading about, it says that Samson threw a feast is the word that it's used in our Bibles. But in the Hebrew, when you look at it, and as I started reading a bunch of Hebrew scholars and Jewish scholars, the word actually means drinking party. Samson throws a drinking party. And I was like, well, maybe he didn't drink, but Jewish scholars will tell you they believe that that's in there, and the reason that word is used is to make it clear that Samson once again violated his covenant with God because he wanted something. He saw it and he said, I know I'm not supposed to do this. I know I've committed not to do this. I know that I'm supposed to save God's people, but this just looks so good. And once again, he likely engages in something that God has told him, don't do this. Don't get involved with this. Another thing that Samson is commanded not to do, the Bible says God told him that a razor was to never touch his head. He's not supposed to cut his hair. And, I look down through it and I'm like, well, technically, Samson didn't cut his hair. He's not the one who put the razor to his head. Delilah did that. She's the one who cut his hair. So see, he can be off the hook on this one. But the problem with it is that the whole reason Samson's in the mess he is with Delilah, where he gets his hair shaved after God has commanded him not to, is because he ignored another commandment of God. You see, he knew that he was not supposed to be marrying outside of the Jewish faith. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, God had made it very clear to his people. He says, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your children away from following me to serving other gods. And exactly what God said was going to happen there, if people disobeyed, that they would turn away from God and serve other gods, is exactly what happens with Samson. He ignores God's command not to intermarry with these other people. He does it anyway, and he is so caught up in pleasure. He's so caught up in Delilah and what she's able to give him and how she's able to please him. He's so caught up in this that he completely disregards God, and it ends up leading to him and his final covenant, his commitment to God as a Nazirite of not shaving his hair. It happens because he's involved with a woman that he never should have been involved with in the first place. And you and I need to realize whenever we get caught up in pleasing ourselves and finding pleasure, what we tend to do is we tend to say, oh God, I know you said this, but I'm not going to do what you say because I like the way this feels. I like the way this tastes. I like what this is giving me. And we're so caught up in pleasure that we completely and utterly disregard everything that our loving Father, the man that we say is our King, our Master, our Lord, we completely ignore everything he says. If you ever notice, if you start saying a lot of things, well, I know that I'm supposed to do this, or I know that the Bible says this, but I feel, fill in the blank. If you catch yourself saying that, you better come to the understanding now that your pleasure and what pleases you has overtaken what God told you to do. Anytime you want to excuse something that is very clearly a clear, godly, biblical principle, and you want to replace it with, well, I feel this or that, pleasure has taken over in your life, and you are ignoring what God has told you to do. And that's a scary thing because where it leads is extremely, extremely dangerous. When pleasure becomes my God, I renege on the commitments that really, truly matter. I resist the advice of the godly people around me, and I refuse to listen to anything that God has to say. And the next thing that I do is I repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. When pleasure is our God, we will do the dumbest things in order to be pleased. We will do the most stupid, idiotic thing you can think of in order to feel good. And the bad thing about it is that it's not that we will just do it once. We will make the same mistakes over and over and over and over again. And I think about, watching in my life and watching in the lives of the people I love and care for, how many times we just do stupid things. You look at Samson and it's like, seriously, dude, how could you do this again and again? He hooks up with the first woman who he's not supposed to be involved with, disobeys God, disregards his parents' advice, gets involved in a relationship with her. He eats this honey that he's not supposed to have, all stupid mistakes. And the woman and the honey get him in trouble because he ends up getting in a bet with a bunch of Philistine guys that he ends up having to kill later. And he gets into this trouble because he's disobeying God. And then you see him here with Delilah. And with Delilah, he's completely idiotic because when you read down through the story, what you see him do is she comes to him and he's just so happy to have Delilah. And she comes to him and she says, Samson, tell me what it is that makes you so strong. What's the secret to your strength? Okay, this happens multiple times. And he never really tells her the truth, but he gets sucked in by the God of pleasure. And every time she asks him, it seems like he gets a little closer and he'll tell her things like, oh, the secret to my strength that is if you braid my hair and then I won't have the strength and anybody could take me down. If you braid my hair. And so he wakes up and his hair's braided and he's attacked and he had lied, so his strength is still there. And so again, she comes to him and she says, oh, Samson, come on. And she does this multiple times. over and over and over again, you see Samson making just dumb mistakes. It's like, you look at this guy and you're like, how stupid can you really be? How many times are you going to tell her something, then it happens, and you're like, man, what a weird coincidence. I woke up and my hair was braided, and these guys jumped me. Are you serious? How stupid can he be? I mean, he's an idiot, and so are we. Because when pleasure takes over in our lives, we get caught up in things and we make dumb mistakes, and we look and we're like, man, I can't believe I did that. And then 2 weeks later, we're like, man, I did it again. Whoa, how did that happen? We get caught up in pleasure, and it takes over, and we repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. In Proverbs 26:11, there's an awesome picture that's painted of what this looks like to God. He says, dogs return to eat their vomit, just as fools repeat their foolishness. That is a disgusting picture. Yesterday, I was out at the park with a bunch of our small group leaders, and I walked over and my dog was out there, and they're like, hey, Kerry, it was disgusting. Razzle just threw up all over the place, and then he licked it back up. And I was like, ugh, this is gross. It's disgusting. And that picture of that dog returning to its vomit is what God says we look like whenever we're so foolish to go back to the same old junk over and over and over again and continually repeating our foolishness. And the sad thing is that God has something so much better for us. The other day, my wife and I were walking around Target, and we were looking at the dog food, and I buy cheap dog food, okay? And we were looking at dog food, and as we're walking by the dog food section, I realized there's a refrigerated section now in the Target dog food section. And I was like, I looked over and I was like, seriously? And I told Hannah, I'm like, Hannah, they have refrigerated dog food section now. And we're laughing about it, but since Duck Dynasty is so popular now, I use this term, but all these yuppie people are going over to this refrigerated dog section, and they're buying like these $12 packages of food for dogs that are refrigerated that are like this big. And I'm like, what are they doing? What are they doing? But then I think about what God has this refrigerated dog food section for us. And it's so much better than returning to our vomit. And God looks at us and is like, I have this awesome meal for you. Why do you keep going back to the vomit? Why do you keep repeating your foolishness? And the only thing I can come up with, and the only thing I can see in the life of Samson, that I see in my life and so many other people's lives, is that over and over again we get caught up in these things because pleasure is our God. And we buy into a lie that we're going to find something that is going to please us. And so we'll do it over and over and over again, trying to find something that makes us happy. Trying to find that food. Well, when I eat it, I just feel so much better, until you feel guilty 3 hours later. Until, when you get on the computer and you and your wife have had multiple fights about it, and we look up porn, and then we get in this huge fight, and our wife's wanting to walk out the door on us. And then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And we repeat the same stupid mistakes because we believe that we're going to find pleasure. Samson, how stupid can you be, man? Give me a break. You're going to continually go back and tell this lady your secrets and get closer and closer every time. What an idiot. But you see, whenever pleasure's our God, we renege on the important commitments in our lives. We resist the advice of the godly people around us. We completely refuse to listen to God. We repeat the same mistakes, and we reject common sense altogether. Common sense just goes right out the window. You can't look at Samson and say, oh, that guy was pretty wise. He had a lot of common sense. No, he told the woman 3 times. And the part that makes it even worse, this is so cliche and it makes him look so stupid. These guys are hiding in his closet. All right, the guys are in his closet. She shaves his head, and they come out of his closet. And I'm like, he is totally just missing the obvious. And when pleasure is our God, we miss the obvious. But when God is God, He says, listen, I have something so much better for you. Proverbs 2 verse 6 says, for the Lord gives wisdom. From His mouth come knowledge and understanding. See, God says, listen, I can give you a clear and accurate picture. I can help you see things with clarity. But whenever I'm not your God, everything gets muddy, and it gets to where you can't see clearly, and all of the common sense that you have just goes out the window because you're so caught up in finding the thing that pleases you. And we throw common sense to the side, and God is standing there saying, I can help you see this so much better. I can help you see this so much more clearly. But pleasure is our God, and common sense is just gone. Things that normally we would be able to look at and say, wow, that is not a bright idea. I'm not going to do that. You know, things that to everybody else around us is like, hey, stupid, don't do that. That's going to end with you dying. Don't do it. You know, and I think about how many times I've seen people say, don't do that. It's a bad idea. And then I watch somebody do it. And you're like, why did you just do that? Because we believe the lie that we're going to find something that's going to replace God, that's going to please us more than him, and pleasure becomes our God. So I believe that we got to look at our lives and say, man, if pleasure becomes my God and it keeps me from remembering what's really important, and I push people away that really care about me because I refuse to listen to them, and I disconnect myself from God, and I'm just going to make mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. How do I get away from that? How do I dethrone the God of pleasure? Well, I think I first need to realize that if I'm going to dethrone the God of pleasure, I have to maximize the consequences. I have to see how bad things can get. You know, Samson, I don't believe as he was seeking after this pleasure, when he looks at the first lady and is like, she looks good to me. And when he's eating that honey and he's breaking that commitment, and as he slowly breaks his commitment to God with Delilah, and as he disobeys, as he does all those things, I don't think he had any thought of what the future was going to hold and the kind of consequence that he was going to have to pay. He never imagined that his pursuit of passion would lead to his being blinded and enslaved, like it says in Judges 16 through 20. It says, but he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. And they brought him down to Gaza, and they bound him with chains, and he was a grinder in the prison. Now you think about this man that we talked about earlier, who kids looked up to, who they're like, yeah, that's who I want to be. He was like that strong, he was like the epitome of what a man should look like. When I think about him, I just think like him just being shredded, and just like, I just have this picture of Samson in my head that's like, that is a man's man. That's who you want to be like. And he goes from being this guy who, you know, he's someone who can take care of himself. He can fight. He gets the women that he wants. He's like this, he's just a stud. And I don't think he ever thought where that pursuit of pleasure and passion was going to take him. But he never had an inkling that this would end up with him being blinded and enslaved. It says that he woke up and he didn't even realize that God wasn't with him anymore. She shaves his head, he wakes up and he thinks, man, I'm just going to whoop these dudes like I have every other time. And they grab a hold of him, and for the first time in his life, he doesn't have the power to overcome anymore. And I wonder what went through Samson's mind in that moment, when it got that dark, that he was like, something's different here. The thought had to go through his mind, what have I done? How did it get this bad? And they take him and they gouge out this man's eyes. And they take him and they chain him up. And it says they took him to a grinder. And if you've ever seen in the movies how they'll grind wheat and things like that, they have the big things, you know, that you see the cattle will walk around in a circle and it grinds things up. They take Samson, this incredible specimen, and he has no more power to be able to fight him off. They poke his eyes out, they chain him up, and they treat him like a filthy animal. And here he is, and he's walking around this thing, and pleasure had been his God, and you have to think Samson had to be going, man, how did I get here? And you and I need to understand that we've got to maximize the consequences of making pleasure our God, and understand that although Samson's case may seem extreme, it is in no way unique. Because anytime we make pleasure our God, it will destroy us. It will damage us beyond repair. You know, a couple months ago, I got a phone call. There was this kid that we grew up with over in Alton, and his name was Mikey. And there was actually a lot of kids that used to come to our youth group over at Alton. And some of those kids, they would look and they would say, man, life with God is so much better, and they would change their lives, and God was able to bless them. But for the most part, most of those teens that we came into contact with and that were my friends in high school, they looked and they said, yeah, there's God, but there is that woman. There is that this. And they would find all these things to please them, and they would throw God to the side. And I was looking on Facebook, and I got a phone call saying, hey, your friend Mikey overdosed on heroin. And I was thinking, I was like, oh, man. And Mikey was like, he was such a nice kid. Anybody who knew Mikey, I loved him to death. But I started looking through Mikey's Facebook. And I started realizing that Mikey had been in the pursuit of pleasure. You see on Mikey's Facebook, I saw women. I saw lots of booze. Obviously, he was searching for something. He was using heroin, and he overdosed and died. But Mikey had also, when we knew Mikey, Mikey was tiny. He was a rail. He was super skinny. He looked like Darion. I mean, just, you know, he was like tiny. And he was just this rail thin guy, and he had just honestly he was a big dude now. And I was looking, and as I was looking through that Facebook, I thought, man, it seems like he had tried everything. He had pleasured himself on food, on women, on wine. Heroin finally came to bite Mikey. And I looked at his life, and I think about Samson, and I think, man, Samson's circumstances were extreme, but they're not at all unique. And I went to the funeral. And I sat there with my friends, and I saw all these people we went to school with, all these people who I'd met, actually, who had come to a bunch of our youth group functions, who had chose to make other things their God. And I looked as their faces and their eyes were dark, like just dark circles under their eyes. Some of them were sitting next to us high as a kite, and they just looked, their skin was pulled tight. And I looked at them, and I thought, man, I cannot believe where these people have ended up. And I look at Samson's life, and pleasure drove him to where he was. Pleasure had taken him, it was a consequence of his sin where he ended up. And you and I need to understand, and you need to realize, whenever you let pleasures take control of your life, and they're on the throne in your life, the consequences are great. How many families have we seen that have been completely destroyed? How many spouses have looked and said, man, that woman or that man looks so much better than my husband. I think they could definitely take better care of me than my husband or my wife does. And there's a spouse somewhere whose heart is broken, and children who look at their family and they say, how did this happen? I thought my parents loved me. I thought they loved each other. I thought they cared about each other. And everything is wrecked. Everything is demolished because we wanted pleasure to sit on the throne. How many people looked and they thought, man, yeah, you know, like, I know there's some consequences, but, you know, it's only one beer, and they sit there with their families. And how many stories of drunk driving have you heard where families have been utterly torn apart? And, you know, it's because a dad will sit there and he'll have a beer, and he's like, oh, you know, yeah, one more ain't going to hurt. Yeah, one more is not going to hurt. You know, man, it's so good, and just hammers them back. How many kids have been beat up because of stuff like that? How many times have people said, oh, man, no, I got this under control. I was talking to Mikey's brother, and he said, you know, Mikey told me, hey, man, it's no big deal. I got this under control. And we think, we don't understand that pleasure takes over. We think that we've got this under control, and when you make pleasure your God, it will destroy you. See, pleasure makes a terrible, terrible God. But if you worship God, he can bring about great pleasure in your life. But we get those things screwed up, and we get them backwards, and our lives are destroyed because of it. And we need to understand the consequences of making pleasure our God are horrible. Proverbs 17:11 says, a rebellious man seeks only evil, so a cruel messenger will be sent against him. It says, listen, you don't want God to be king? You want to rebel against him? You don't want him to be the Lord, the master of your life? Okay. That's fine, but I'm going to warn you now. If you rebel against God, a cruel messenger will be sent, because God has got to show you that pleasure cannot be your God. Nothing can be your God except for God, and that's a very tough lesson to learn. And most everyone in here can look back at some point in your life, and you can look back and you can realize when God knocked you upside your head because you had something else on the throne other than him. The Crossings Church it's just full of people who are getting their lives put back together because they've had so many other things on the throne. And we have story after story after story here of people who could stand up right now and say, I made pleasure my God, and because of it, my family fell apart. I made pleasure my God, and now because of it, I'm burdened by so much debt. I'm burdened by so much hurt. I'm burdened by so much sorrow because of these things. And they would tell you, rebellion to God and putting something else on the throne destroys you, because a cruel messenger will come around and he will set you straight. You need to realize if pleasure is your God, that there are dire consequences. Second of all, we need to understand not only can it get just really bad, but understand that pleasure will never fulfill me. I need to see, I've got to remove pleasure from the throne of my life, because I am never going to be fulfilled. You know, Samson, in my view, I look at him, I'm like, man, he may be the most pleasure-driven character of all the Bible, but he's not the only person in the Bible who sought after pleasure in order for them to find something better in life. You look at what Solomon has to say in Ecclesiastes 2, verse 1 and verse 17, 18. He says, I said to myself, let's go for it. Experiment with pleasure. Have a good time. Sounds a lot like a statement that people today use, right? It's cliche and everybody's tired of hearing YOLO, but that's kind of what it sounds like he's saying, right? He's like, hey man, I'm young. I'm going to go out now and I'm going to party. Now let's go for it. I'm going to experiment with pleasure. Now I'm just going to have an awesome time. And think about how many times you've thought that. You want that momentary happiness, so you're like, I'm just going to go for it. Let's do wild abandon, throw everything, all caution to the wind. I want to try this. I want to find this because I think this is going to please me. I'm doing this. That's what Solomon said, but then he says right after that, after he says, let's go for it, experiment with pleasure, have a good time. But then he says, there was nothing to it. Nothing but smoke. I hate life. As far as I can see, what happens on earth is a bad business. It's smoke, spitting into the wind. And I hated everything I had accomplished and accumulated on this earth. See, he says, I went for it. I chased after the wind, and it left me empty-handed. Yeah, I had all this junk. I had all this good stuff, but I still looked around, even though I had attained all of these things that I thought were going to bring me pleasure. They were right there. I had them, and I still looked around and said, nothing. I have nothing. I'm miserable. I'm not fulfilled. And that's what we tend to do. We think that we're going to find this thing that's going to fulfill us. We think, oh man, I'm going to drink that. I'm going to take that. I'm going to get with this person. I'm going to get with that person, and it's going to make me feel whole. And we get those things, and then a little ways down the road, we're looking there and we're like, didn't do it. I'm still not fulfilled. Because we're trying to fill a hole that isn't able to be filled with anything except for God. God is the only thing that is able to fulfill us. Samson chases after all this stuff and he wants to be happy, and he ends up becoming a mockery. The whole time it was right in front of him. The thing that could fulfill him was right in front of his face. Pleasure wasn't going to do it, but God was able to. And so if I'm going to dethrone the God of pleasure, I've got to maximize the consequences, understand that pleasure will never fulfill me, but I need to realize the benefits of worshiping God. Psalms 37 verse 4 says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. He says, listen, if you will find your pleasure in God, he will give you the things that you're searching for. He knows more what you desire and what you long for and what you need. He knows it better than you do. Stop chasing after everything else and finding delight in all these things that you think are going to give you pleasure, because you're going to be empty. But delight yourself in the Lord, and he will fill you up. He will give you the desires of your heart. The Bible says that he wants you not only to have life, but he wants you to have life to the full. But he's not able to bless us with that full life when everything else is on the throne. He makes that clear time and time and time again in his word. That life that you're chasing after, the only way you're ever going to find it is by worshiping God. You know, you see bumper stickers that have Jeremiah 29:11-14, and I see t-shirts and things all the time with that on there. It says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And we look at that and we're like, oh yeah, see, God wants to get it, and we think God just wants to hand us all this stuff, but we don't read on past that where it says, yeah, I'm going to give you things, but I'm going to do this when you seek me with all of your heart. when I become number one in your life, when I'm the one sitting on the throne, that's when I'm able to give you hope. That's when I'm able to give you a life. That's when your future looks bright, is when I'm on the throne. But you put anything else on that throne, and you're right back to that same screwed up future that you had before you even met me. And God wants us to know that He is the only one who can fulfill us. And we need to realize the benefit of worshiping God. And finally, the fourth thing I have to do is I have to develop my own faith. See, I think part of the problem with Samson is if you look, I don't see any place really where Samson's parents are also held to a high standard. You see that as you read down through Samson's life. He has a mother and a father who love God. And as you read through the story of Samson, you don't see them doing the same thing Samson does. In fact, you see them being like, Samson, don't do this, don't do this. And it seems that they hold up their end of their bargain. He had a great example of what a godly man should look like. He had a great example of a family who keeps God on the throne. And he's not the only guy in Scripture who had that. You know, there was another guy in the New Testament who had also a phenomenal example of what it meant to keep God on the throne, and his name was Timothy. And we know that Timothy had that because Paul writes a letter in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. He says this to Timothy. He says, I have been reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice. And I am persuaded that it now lives in you also. And he says, Timothy, you know, you had this mother and this grandmother who had a great faith. They have God on the throne. And he looks at Timothy and he says, and I'm convinced that you do as well. But you look at Samson, and Samson had a great example as well. A faith that lived in his parents. But the problem is sometimes I think we can live on the faith of others rather than the faith living in us, and that's not the way it works. We have got to develop a faith that we own, a faith of our own. We've got to be the ones who make sure that God is on the throne, that He stays on top. It has to live within us. Samson and Timothy, their lives are completely different. You see, Samson's life ends in tragedy. Yeah, he takes out a bunch of Philistines with him, and a bunch of them die, but he dies committing suicide. You know, it's funny that Samson was always looking for things that he could find pleasure in, and then finally, whenever he loses his eyes, he's finally able to see what really matters. And here he is, and he looks and he says, God, and he knows he's blown it, and he says, just one last time, use me this last time. And he has him put his hands on these two pillars, and he shoves this building down. And it caves in, and it says that he kills more Philistines in that day than he had the rest of his life, which was a lot. But it ends in tragedy because he dies alongside him. And I don't believe that that's what God had designed for his life. I believe that Samson could have had something so much better had he listened to God and kept God on the throne rather than his pleasure on the throne. And you look at Timothy's life and you read about Paul and Timothy and the difference that they made in people's lives, because Timothy decided to take his parents' faith and he decided to own it. He decided to let it live inside of him, and he decided to put God on the throne. And you hear stories of Paul and Timothy, and you hear Paul talking to him about the difference that he's making in the lives of the people around him. And I believe that that's what God longed for Samson. I believe that's what He longs for everyone here. But God is never going to be able to bless you with that kind of life. He's never going to be able to allow you to benefit and bless and change the future in other people's lives if He's not on the throne. And we have a choice that's put before us of what's going to dwell on that throne. Are you going to be like Timothy, or are you going to be like Samson? Are you going to sit around and go to a church and be like, man, it's cool to see all these people doing this, and never grab it and own it for yourself and put God on that throne and allow God to really use you, to allow Him to have you to have the kind of life you've always longed for? Or are you just going to let it pass you by like Samson did and end in tragedy? God is always giving us a choice that says, listen, you can put me on the throne and I can reign and we can rock this together and life can be so phenomenal. But you have a choice to make.